I want to begin with a neuroscience story that's true in my life, and it involves a longtime colleague of mine in mental health, clinical work. He had a brain tumor some years back, and he detected something was wrong because he was having trouble with his speech. He would confabulate some things that he didn't mean to. One day at work, it all kind of culminated in a humorously poignant way when someone asked what he was doing over the weekend or what his plans were for the weekend on a Friday, and he was going to a flea market, but it came out, I'm going to the cheeseburger. And that was when another nurse said, I think it's time for you to go to the emergency room because he was having some other issues with coordination. But the doctors and the neurologists didn't believe at first that there was anything wrong with um, that there wouldn't be a tumor where he thought it was, or wouldn't be something wrong with where he thought it was because he's right-handed, which means that the speech area should be on the left because the opposite side controls the opposite side of the body, opposite hemisphere, I mean. And our language actually develops with our dominant hand. And so there were some features of this speech that were incongruent with the neuroanatomy until he had a functional MRI where you need to think about things and what you would say in different situations. And this is where a a neurosurgeon learned that he actually has two Broca's areas. Broca area again is the speech center, which ordinarily does not happen. And so he started having some conversations with him about his upbringing to inquire if it was possible that he was born left-handed. And so reflecting back, he remembered how at school he was socialized into always using the right hand, even though he's quite ambidextrous. And in some of the Catholic schools, the nuns would notoriously slap away the left hand um, because it was the evil hand or a sign of the influence of the devil. So sure enough, because of those social experiences, his brain responded by developing a second speech center. And in the fMRI, every time his heart beat and he spoke, his brain expanded with blood and pressed up against the tumor. And then he couldn't coordinate his words. So when they removed the tumor, then everything was successful, thankfully, and he could speak normally again. But it illustrates how things do not arise from the ground up or entirely from the top down, but how there's so much of so much of what determines our health is socially constructed. And I tell this story because the majority of people are right-handed, just as the majority of people are heterosexual. Society is primarily organized around these norms, which are often viewed as the default or normative states. This can lead to social structures, language, and practices that favor these majority traits. Right, like quote, right-handed, is synonymous with correct. The term right-handed carries connotations of being proper, which can implicitly suggest that left-handedness is less correct or abnormal. Similarly, heterosexuality is often perceived as the normal or natural orientation, which can stigmatize any other orientation. And then fluidity. Some people, like my friend, can use both hands equally well, much like how some individuals are bisexual or queer experiencing attraction to multiple genders. This demonstrates that both hand dominance and sexual orientation can be fluid and not strictly binary. And then I see a connection to sexual fluidity. Just as some individuals may not have a fixed dominant hand, some people experience fluidity in their sexual orientation over their lifespan. Another powerful parallel in my friend's story is conversion therapy and social pressure as it relates to sexuality. Forced right-handedness. Like I was saying in the schools, historically left-handed individuals were often forced to use their right hand, especially in religious settings. This can be likened to how some LGBTQ individuals face pressure to conform to heterosexual norms through socialization or shame or even conversion therapies or societal expectations. And then there's this impact of correction. In my friend's case, his brain, through neuroplasticity, actually adapted by developing another speech center to compensate for the confusion socially around right and left-handedness. And just as forcing left-handed individuals to use their right hand can cause psychological and physical distress, it also contributed to a learning disability, which my friend never made that connection until decades and decades later, that it wasn't so pathologized or individualized to his biology, but also partly socially constructed. When the brain's trying to develop two speech centers instead of one, it complicates the the development around learning. And so forcing individuals to conform to a heterosexual orientation can lead to significant mental health challenges and identity conflicts, which has become somewhat of an epidemic in terms of mental health risk that I see all the time, deal with, and try to respond to or write about, have built resources around and support groups around. Both hand dominance and sexual orientation have some biological underpinnings, like I said, with Broca's area in the case of handedness, genetics, prenatal development, brain structure, that all influences whether a person is left-handed or right-handed or their sexual orientation. But there are social determinants, social factors such as cultural norms and the educational experiences I talked about, personal experiences, trauma. This all plays a significant role in how individuals express hand dominance or sexual orientation. For example, gender-based violence can impact how people understand themselves and safety and then express their sexuality. So some things are superimposed onto left-handed people were interpretations of the Bible. In many Christian cultures, the right hand is associated with righteousness and virtue, while the left hand was linked to sin and the devil. It stems from some biblical references like Matthew 25, 33, 34, where the righteous are placed on God's right hand and the wicked on the left. The word left is derived from the word for sinister in Latin and has come to mean something evil or harmful throughout the English language and other languages. Similarly, in many languages, words related to the left hand carry all kinds of negative connotations. In the Middle Ages in Europe, left-handedness was viewed with suspicion because it was thought that left-handed individuals were in league with the devil or possessed by the devil or other evil spirits. And that's how it became associated with witchcraft in the United States. Being left-handed was seen as someone more likely to practice witchcraft and other heretical practices. Moreover, I find this analogy striking because modern studies suggest that 85 to 90% of people identify as right-handed. And that is the same estimate for heterosexual identity. A 2021 Gallup poll found that 86% of Americans identify as heterosexual. It's been a right-handed and heteronormative dominant world. The point I'm making here is if we can see how big of a deal society made the arbitrary use of a right or left hand, then imagine how obsessive and homophobic, transphobic, and heterosexist groups can be. So, to the mental health risk, 45% of LGBTQ youth contemplated suicide last year. And when an LGBTQ youth identifies with more than one marginalized group, like Black and gay, for example, um, or lower socioeconomic status and lesbian, then the risk is significantly amplified. 1.8 million LGBTQ youth seriously contemplated suicide last year. It's a devastating statistic and underscores why pride as a social movement, as a social justice movement, as an awareness month is urgent and still pertinent. This vulnerable population are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than heterosexual peers. The number one variable in this is family and social acceptance. When scientific researchers control for this acceptance, then suicide rates are resemblant of the general population, which further debunks the old 20th century myths and notions around homosexuality as a mental health disorder. And homosexuality was used in the DSM until maybe 1986, I want to say. It was removed in the 80s because shame, depression, and even suicide ideation is a normal human response to rejection or alienation. But I want to emphasize a quote about this. LGBTQ folks are not inherently prone to suicide risk because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but rather they are placed at higher risk because of how they are mistreated and stigmatized. Parental and familial rejection is the number one risk factor in this crisis. So I'm saying this because undoubtedly we are all touched by the suicide crisis in America, and this is a prominent theme involved in it. And so it gives us one clear action step of how we can make a difference with the people in our lives, people in this community that we love, interact with, or how to access support if you're impacted directly. Having one supportive adult in an LGBTQ youth's life decreases the likelihood of suicide by 40%. According to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, limited or underrepresentation within mental health care can contribute to stigma because it makes it less likely that somebody would go seek professional care if the space isn't safe, if it isn't affirming of sexual identity or gender identity. And a lack of these affirming spaces results in fear of judgment and discrimination, and definitely affects whether one ultimately has access to care if they need it for depression or some other mental health condition. So, as a parent, a caregiver, or loved one, it may not be as simple as whether or not your family member is willing to seek help, because sometimes we label patients erroneously as treatment resistant, which puts undue emphasis again on the individual instead of looking at the context surrounding the individual. Um, okay. So back to judgment. This is about not labeling, not judging a person in crisis, which speaks to tolerance and equanimity. Not labeling someone who might be struggling for whatever reason, but all discrimination begins with the lottery of birth. However that happens. I mean, even if we control it somehow as as a disembodied soul in a different dimension. But I call it that because you can't make an exchange after the fact, right? So this is very crucial because after birth, the environment and culture become almost a second skin. Either you can't remove it, or when one could, they may not realize that they can. LGBTQ is is also somewhat, as an identity, is also somewhat of a social construct, like I was saying, because of the way heterosexual people relate to people who are different from them, being the majority. And so this is why terms like queer and gay were pejorative, but reclaimed by people as pride, right? Because they were used to shame. And if there's going to be acceptance, people who identify as such or who were identified by others, otherwise, who enters the room with their sexual identity? It's not like, nice to meet you, I'm heterosexual. It's a very personal exchange when relevant, depending on the level of intimacy. So there needed to be civil rights movements, and much progress was made in the 60s along with the other liberation struggles. And then there was a major setback with the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, which was largely blamed on homosexual behavior. And till this day, HIV and AIDS remains a very stigmatized disease. And then progress came with abrogating the ban on gay marriage in the 21st century. But now we have this youth suicide crisis, significantly exacerbated by um, having the identity of LGBTQ. In psychology, there have been different models of sexual identity that I think are meaningful to kind of understand the movement of pride. Uh, Previously, for centuries, it was just thought to be dichotomous. Someone is either heterosexual or homosexual. Later, from the work of Kinsey and the Kinsey Institute in Indiana, it was thought of as a bipolar spectrum. Someone could be more this way or more this way. If they were in the middle, that would be bisexual. But researchers later realized how limiting this bipolar spectrum is. It makes sense sometimes for mental health conditions. So there's still an undertone of pathologization of homosexuality. Substance use disorders on a spectrum. A person could be mildly addicted and severely dependent, right? And the further you go in one direction, the more you move away from the other side. But that's not necessarily true of sexuality. And so then the researcher Storms developed a two-dimensional orthogonal model, which means that, which suggests that homoeroticism and heteroeroticism are not diametrically opposed, that a person could experience homoerotic sensations doesn't really say anything or does not determine how heteroerotic one could feel and vice versa. So both being responsive, being responsive to both might be considered bisexual, but that term is still rooted in binary thinking. Or someone could be very low on the eroticism in on each scale in this model, and researchers might have thought that meant asexuality. But just to give a deeper sense to today of how fluid and multifaceted this really is, and why tolerance matters, why non-judgment matters. Let's reflect on the following framings. Number one, your sexual identity. This is how you define yourself sexually, maybe as a heterosexual person or LGBTQ, but it could also mean you identify as monogamous. You might be in a partnership. You might be in a committed partnership. That's your idea um, of a marriage or a committed relationship or romantic relationship, or more promiscuous or polyamorous. Now, after considering that, your sexual identity, you can reflect on how that may or may not describe your actual sexual behavior. or may no longer describe your actual sexual behavior, fantasy content, or to which sexual stimuli you could respond to, even if only internally. And number two, so now there is sexual interest or attraction. So this is what you and anyone wants to do, regardless of if you do it. And three is sexual behavior. This is what you actually do, whether or not it's consistent with your sexual identity or sexual interest, right? Because it's certainly possible that people can be socialized into sexual experiences, even totally consensual ones, that are not congruent with their identity or with their heart. And four, then we can come back to sexual orientation as perhaps a distinct type of sexual interest. Now, I think when we reflect on these psychosexual inner realms, we understand how much our perception, again, the, the construct of reality, how much our perception of reality is socially and culturally determined. And refer back to the tolerance quote at the beginning and the left-handed story of my friend. And then with pride, we can see that coming out is not so much an additive step. Like, why would somebody need to come out? It's actually subtractive. It implies that an individual is ceasing to hide something integral to their identity as it is my minoritized positionality. Accordingly, heterosexual individuals do not come out straight at like 18 years old or whatever age, nor would one likely feel moved to come out as officially non-virgin after first sex. But because it's assumed one is heterosexual unless deemed otherwise or otherwise noted, um, again, gay and lesbian or queer are inverted pejorative terms. Pride is a process of reclamation, of empowerment, and the collective undoing of socialized stigma and shame associated with healthy, adult, safe, consensual sexual interest or relationships that do not correspond to the norms or cultural, religious, or political laws and standards. I don't speak for any community, and certainly not this community. Everyone has their own experiences, is my point. I'm just sharing metaphysical insights to support equality, um, to leverage my privilege for the historically marginalized LGBTQ community, which is certainly not a monolith, and yet had all things been sexually more egalitarian, then maybe pride wouldn't carry the same significance. In a similar way, that able-bodied people don't really identify as able-bodied because it is conceived as the default mode. It is only deviations from this that are othered. In a world where there aren't wheelchair ramps, it's salient that you might have a disability. If everywhere was accessible, then it changes the meaning of ability and disability. A moral philosophy of tolerance ought to integrate spiritual wisdom and these psychological insights and social principles to cultivate an inclusive and compassionate society. Tolerance is derived from Old French, tolerance, and then Latin, tolerare, which we think of and maybe was originally conceived of as to bear, but there's also a definition which I find very relevant here, which is to permit. Now, permission involves a discipline of the mind to say yes to the experiences of minoritized groups. Do we want to be a kind of person that is always saying no? This is fear-based. This is rejection of reality. This acceptance transcends mere endurance, aiming to appreciate and embrace diversity. You might say, well, then don't we need to be intolerant of people who are intolerant? I don't think that's the right way to frame it. Or with war, do we need to be intolerant of war? No, we need to be people who will no longer participate in intolerance. And when we no longer remain complicit and participate, it will not have um, the social energy that it needs to continue. Otherwise, we risk absorbing the worst back into ourselves and contributing to the cycle of intolerance. Because trauma absolutely can induce prejudice, discrimination, racism, bigotry, right? If somebody gets into a car accident, they will discriminate against the road, being in cars. If somebody is sexually traumatized, they will likely make broad generalizations about the identity of the perpetrator for protection. This is why violence begets violence and why we must break the cycle of intolerance through love. Spiritual teachings emphasize equanimity. So we can think of the equality within tolerance. Equanimity means to be able to make um, to have a mind so open that it can permit all the things that it doesn't understand. And in this state, maintaining balance is what we're prioritizing against external and internal negativity. And this balance arises from knowledge, from wisdom. The more wisdom, the more balance, the more equanimity, often cultivated through meditation, through introspection. This is an internal discipline. It enables individuals to outwardly manifest it and transform societal no's into yeses, into affirmation of the divine Leela, of like we said, of the universe and the Lord's play. By advocating for inclusive public policies such as the ones we talked about affirming the dignity of all individuals and validating love. And in this ecological and bidirectional understanding that we have our biology, we have our culture, and they commingle, an individual is shaped by this collective trauma. War and other traumatic experiences entrench stereotypes and heighten in-group and out-group distinctions. The moral philosophy of tolerance that I'm sharing now is an encouragement towards nuance and nuanced conversations and the continuous cultivation of empathy. We don't know what other people's experiences are, as Regina wisely put it. I will close with an African story of Akan mythology. There is a spider in this story named Anansi. It's known as Anansi and the Pot of Wisdom. In the beginning, Nyame, the sky god, possessed all the wisdom there was in the world. The world wasn't too wise yet. He kept it in a large, beautiful clay pot, which he guarded closely. Anansi, the clever spider, desired to be the wisest creature on earth and devised a plan to obtain that pot of wisdom from Nyame. One day, Anansi approached the sky god with a proposition. O great one, I have served you faithfully for many years, and I wish to be the wisest of all creatures so I can help others and spread your wisdom throughout the land. May I have the pot of wisdom? Now, Nyame, seeing Anansi's genuinely strong desire, despite the ulterior motives, agreed to give him the pot. However, he warned Anansi, remember, wisdom is meant to be shared, not hoarded. And Anansi thanked Nyame and took the pot home. Anansi was super excited. Every time he looked into the clay pot, he learned something new. However, as time passed, he didn't want to share with anyone else. Greedily, he decided to keep the pot away from the world, believing that if he had all the wisdom for himself, he would be revered like the sky god. Anansi thought the best way to do this, to hide the pot, is to keep it safe at the top of the tallest tree in the forest. So he tied the pot to his belly and began to climb up the tree. But the pot kept pulling him down. It was heavy and cumbersome, making this climb impossible. He would go up and then he would fall back down a few branches. As he struggled, his young son, Takuma, saw him and offered some practical advice. Hey, Dad, if you tie the pot to your back instead of your belly, it'll be easier to climb. Anansi initially ignored his son's advice, but soon realized that Takuma was right. He tied the pot on his back and found it much easier to climb to the top of the tree. Upon reaching the apex, Anansi suddenly realized the irony here. Despite possessing all the wisdom of the world, he had overlooked a simple piece of advice from his young son. At that moment, Anansi remembered Nyame's warning. He understood that wisdom should not be hoarded, but shared. Feeling ashamed, he decided to fulfill his promise to Nyame, the sky god. He untied the pot from his back at the top of the tallest tree and let it fall. Crashing to the ground, the pot shattered, and the pieces of wisdom scattered in all directions across the world. From that day on, wisdom was shared among all people, and every person always had a piece of it.